What is abstraction? If you think this is abstraction, what about these? European and American artists of the 20th century used abstract forms to create a revolutionary new language for art, free of the conventions of representational painting. For artists in the Middle East in the 1950s, abstraction offered something different. A connection to historical practices and a route to new visual languages steeped in local traditions.
Abstract art in the Arab world emerged, as far as we know, in the 1940s and 1950s, at a time of great changes in the region. It paralleled other movements such as the emergence of independence movements and nationalist movements. The rise of Pan-Arabism, for example, was also a different facet of the 1950s. What makes abstract art special in the Middle East and North Africa is the different influences that led to its emergence. And so you have, for instance, artists who are non-Muslim, who were inspired by Islamic geometry. You have artists who were Jewish, who were inspired by maybe Western abstraction or maybe just local elements. You have artists who were Amazigh, who were inspired by their own letters and their own calligraphy that later emerged into their paintings. And so it isn't really a matter of tracing it back to the rise of Western abstraction of the early 20th century. Abstraction in the Arab world, I think, certainly had some influences from the West, but also had influences from the East and had influences from the local context of the region itself.
Today, as museums open their collections to new geographies, new stories of modernisms are being told. The exhibition, Taking Shape, Abstraction from the Arab World, 1950s to the 1980s, is one of such efforts at widening the field.
After the Second World War, many of the artists, sort of a wave of artists from the region, went to study abroad on government-sponsored scholarships. And the 50s is really when they started coming back and started forming art collectives and groups, which, by the way, were not only comprised of artists, but also poets, writers, journalists.
In the mid-20th century, the Arab art world was spread across a number of cities: Baghdad, Cairo, Beirut, Casablanca, and others. It was a time of great exchange and interconnection, both within the region and with countries abroad, such as the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia.
Of course, there was the period of decolonization, but it's also a time when a lot of changes are happening. These nations are modernizing, industrialization is happening in a lot of these countries. International travel for studies also increased. You mentioned the Soviet Union, and artists were certainly going to institutes in Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as other parts of the world, both in the West, but also in places like China, Japan. So looking at this period of time, we really have to remember that there was a lot of global exchange.
The rate of political change was quick. The painter Minhat Hilmi left Cairo in the early 1950s to study at the Slade School of Fine Arts in London. When she returned, life in Egypt had shifted completely, as her grandson Karim Zaidan explains.
The Egyptian monarchy had fallen apart. And she left Egypt while the monarchy was still intact and came back to a socialist country controlled by Gamal Abdel Nasser, with people bubbling with excitement over the idea that there's going to be social mobility, there's going to be changes to the country, and that Egypt had finally been controlled by Egyptians.
While a lot of these artists were in fact educated in either European or North American institutions, when they came back to their home countries, a lot of them began looking at local heritage and indigenous histories, at things like, kilim rugs or Islamic patterns or metalwork or even body tattoos in certain communities like the Amazigh communities in Morocco and Algeria, and then trying to look at the formal aspects of these objects to study them and reinterpret them in modern ways. And for some of these artists, this was really a means to decolonize culture.
In Morocco, the Casablanca School of Art looked to Amazigh handcrafts. The Moroccan artist Farid Belkahia, returning home from Europe, spurned canvas and painted instead on vellum or lambskin, stretched thin in the traditional manner. This influenced the paint he used. Because oil paint would not stick to the vellum, he turned to dyes made with henna and saffron, and he used them to echo Amazigh motifs of symbols and repeated patterns.
They really began questioning, what does it mean to produce art that is Iraqi or that is Egyptian and so on. And a lot of the times they went back to their ancient histories, be they Islamic or pre-Islamic, to mine references for very site-specific modernisms. For many of these nations, these ancient histories were a unifying factor. This is something that all Egyptians, but for example, the pharaonic histories is something all Egyptians shared, or Mesopotamian histories, something that all Iraqis shared. So they kind of transcended sectarian divides, political divides, and served as a way to, create a unified identity for a state.
The search for a new Arab identity also led artists to look across the region. A shared language, shared histories of overlapping empires, and often shared urban and architectural heritage unified the disparate countries.
My trip to Egypt, the West Bank, Damascus, and Istanbul really affected the way I began to compose my artwork. It took over immediately. It was an immediate and powerful effect on what I was doing. So my still life stopped being what you would recognize as the type of still life in Western art history you would assume it should be. It was completely about geometry rather than about bottles and oranges and what would make a nice breakfast or lunch.
In Jordan in the 1970s, the artist Fakhr-Nisa Zaid set up an art school for women, challenging them to think beyond conventional representation.
I was a very lucky person to meet Fakhr-Nisa Zaid. She's not a very easy person. Fakhr-Nisa Zaid is the one who chooses her students. And I happen to be one of the very lucky ones to be chosen by her to take part and study with her at her institute. But at the very beginning, I thought when she proposed to me to come and to her studio in 1976, I didn't take it seriously. I thought it was just a talk because we were in a social event. And I didn't go. I said I didn't. Then the next day, her son Prince Raad calls me and told me, "My mother was waiting for you yesterday, and why didn't you come?" I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't think that she was serious about it." And that's how I started. And ever since, I stayed with her until her last days in 1991. The experience was an extraordinary experience.
Though women had fewer opportunities to train as professional painters, the Fakhr-Nisa Zaid studio opened doors for a number of women, teaching them in the language of abstraction. The Jordanian artist Hind Nasser was another student at the time.
I had two teachers in my life for my art in particular. One was Fakhr-Nisa Zaid and the other one is nature. And I can't separate myself from them. And I was taking her instructions seriously when she says, at the beginning and always she said, and you must keep your hand in motion. You have always to work and work and work. Your hand should be always in movement. And that helped me a lot, even with the abstract art. Abstract is the truth. It's the essence, the origin.
Calligraphy and traditional Islamic geometry were also important influences.
The analysis of it, the thinking of the geometry, the thinking of a unit that is geometric and how it lives in a world is very much a result of Arabic art. But also I was looking and examining what we see, and in a sense that continued for another 15 years, which was an examination for me, in intellectual examination of what do we see really in that makes us paint illusionistically. And then I began to challenge what we see. If I take the two ends of the cylinder away, will you really see a cylinder? So I began to sort of exploit those things that we know about reality. The composition is from the period where Islamic geometry was deeply influencing my work, and I was thinking analytically. And I cut a rectangle, a square, in a flat cardboard, and behind it I taped two little cylinders. It was just a small still life, one black and one white, and one black and one brown. And then I illuminated the still life with two sources of light. One was weak and blue, and one was stronger and more like a full-range color.
Abstract geometry brought artists not only towards patterns, but questions of reality and representation. Art became a source of profound spiritualism.
If you look at the work of a child, my children used to work in my studio. Wherever they would see me coming back, they come back from school. I had special clothes for them when they come into the studio, and I would allow them to work. And I look at their work and I see the innocence, the beauty, the purity of the work. When you talk about abstract, I believe abstract is going to the roots, and the roots are with these innocent children who are still with this, what we call in philosophy, a priori. They are coming from somewhere else.
Abstraction offered not just geometric forms, but a metaphysical plane. Karim Zaidan, grandson of Minhat Hilmi, talks about his grandmother's work.
All the pieces are so harmonized, they are so geometrically sound, there's such synergy within the pieces that it all directs to a single focal point at the very middle of the piece. And I find that there is a sort of influence in Islamic tradition of art there that does that as well, the geometric synergy and the sort of spirituality that comes from this direct point in the center. It's almost as if she's telling you to look within yourself rather than to just look within the painting and see what you can find. And that, I think, was when she really broke through and became one of the finest abstract artists of the time in Egypt.
As the political situation worsened in the 1960s and 70s, artists used abstract art to express not the optimism of a new national identity, but the pain of conflict and violence, refracted and humanized by their art. Afaf Zreiq, who lived through the civil war in Lebanon, explains its effect on her work.
I do not address directly any political issue in my painting. I try to address the effect of the politics on our psychological and emotional life. So instead of addressing the political events and commemorating the political events that happened during my lifetime, I try to paint the effects of those political events on me personally, because I'm the only one who knows how I feel and how I think other people are feeling. I'm very affected by violence, and the effect of violence on me was the experience of absolute terror And I painted a lot of paintings about terror that lasted for way beyond the civil war in Lebanon and the immediate effects of the particular events in the Lebanese civil war and in the wars of the region. So for me, if I could understand how one experiences fear, and if I can internalize it and express it so that other people can feel it, then I would have done what I'm set out to do.
Art should have a spirit, not just anyone can draw anything. But to have to put a soul and heart into your painting, that is what really art is.
Take a look at Ibrahim As-Salahi's painting The Last Sound of 1964. It depicts a perfect black circle in the center of a square canvas, which explodes in red-toned rays.
It's a work by a Sudanese artist called Ibrahim El-Salahi. He was born in 1930 in just outside Khartoum in Sudan. And he is an artist that brings together so many different influences, whether it's his African identity, his Arab identity, Islamic identity, and his Sudanese identity. And it's a work that he created as an homage to his father, and whose father had just passed away.
Compare this to Kazimir Malevich's Black Square, a similar work of purity and ambition, by which the Russian artist sought to strip off anything non-essential. Almost 50 years separate these two masterpieces, both of which show art as a part of a sublime spirituality, a similar goal reached in very different ways.
Art that emanated from the Arab world is equally important to art that started anywhere else in the world, and should be shown and should be exhibited and researched. Growing up in Paris in the 1990s, I was exposed to a lot of Western art. As a student, I used to visit museums and galleries, and I never saw art that wasn't Western. And even though I grew up in the Middle East, I hadn't seen art of South Asia, of Africa, of the Middle East until well into my 20s. And so it was important for me to try and fill that gap. And I also very much feel that I have a responsibility towards telling the story of the Middle East.
Berjil, which Al-Qassemi founded in 2010, is just one part of the story.
This exhibition was drawn from a single collection, and we had a very particular pool of works to work from. It's important to remember that no single exhibit can tell the entire story of a movement such as abstraction, such an expansive movement as abstraction. And so in that way, we hope to become a part of a larger conversation, a larger kind of body of research that is happening around this subject.
I think that taking shape is a very important first endeavor. It's a first glimpse, but I'm hoping that the show will trigger more interest in and more research about Arab modernisms. And I use the plural because the Arab world is a hugely diverse and
enormous region. And what we're learning more and more as we delve into a more global view of art history is that there are multiple modernisms. Each country develops, or each area, or each region is responding to modernity in a different way and drawing on different resources. So I see this as a first take, a glimpse, through the lens of the Bartiel Art Foundation's holdings. But I'm really eager to see what develops from this, both survey shows, but then also solo shows. There's so many fascinating artists I have encountered for the first time that I would be thrilled to be able to see a solo exhibition and see the range and scope of their work.
Just like the artists in the 1950s and 60s, this exhibition itself, taking shape, Abstraction from the Arab World, participates in the current debate over decolonization.
Well, it's my hope that the next generation of scholars who work on West Asia and North Africa, and who are interested in the material culture of the mid-20th century, will write these artists into their narratives and see new connections among them. I'm also hopeful that the next generation of art historians will have a more expansive view of the canon of artists whom they have to consider when they write about the development of abstraction in the mid-20th century. I believe that anyone who has been able to experience this exhibition, either in person or virtually, will have gained something in his or her perspective that will alter appreciation for abstraction from the mid-20th century.
One of the goals of the exhibition is precisely to position this art as being an inherent, an integral kind of component in global modernism, that it wasn't isolated from developments elsewhere, but complemented them instead. I would love the visitors to recognize that there have been multiple histories that happened alongside each other, and also to acknowledge that art outside of what we perceive as, the sort of a center of scholarship, which traditionally has been Europe and North America, that developments did happen outside this region, which complemented modernism in a meaningful way. So I hope that visitors would begin to question what does abstraction mean in different contexts, and also begin to think about methodologies of studying abstraction in different parts of the world.
How do we broaden our understanding of art history? Once, that was the question raised by Amazigh forms, abstracted Arabic letters, and new renderings of spiritual insight. Now, the challenge of understanding modernism has been passed on to curators, scholars, and museum publics as the process of widening horizons continues.